Jupiter is, I believe, to be the best, and I've seen that, and it's very good. Yeah. Do you have a favorite episode?
Just go ahead.
I'm going to say
Okay.
takeaway.
Right.
Just
Yeah. One of the joys that I have is like, as you're working on stuff, like Andy and I are working on stuff, like we're doing a lot at Fuller and at FYI. I wanted to take some time this afternoon to share with you just some of the latest work that we're doing at FYI, some projects that I'm leading. In March, through FYI, I published a book called Young Adult Ministry Now. It came out of a 5-year research study funded by the Lilly Endowment on young adults and congregations. And I think I might have told you, but just recently we got another 4-year grant to study young adults in congregations for another $1,040,000. So it gives us room to run at some new ideas and do stuff like that, which is super exciting. And we're just really thankful for Lilly. And they make a lot of money and they have to give it away. So if they want to send it our direction, that's really, really great. But it does give us a chance to develop some things. And so the project that we did before was called Maya, which was Ministry Innovations for Young Adults. So we really tried to integrate this idea of young adults and emerging adult literature, Christian practices, a little bit of practical theology, and then this idea of sort of innovation and sort of putting that all together to come up with what we came up with. And one of the results was the book and training that we're doing. Then we're doing a training on October 20th on that work. So if you know of anybody that wants to be a part of that, that would be great. But we wanted to launch a new project, and it's not called Maya, it's called DIA, which is Discipleship Initiatives with Young Adults. And the idea with DIA is that we wanted to take a deeper look at the spiritual journeys of young adults and really think about what does it mean for congregations to support that work. Our team has been made up of some great people, a couple of research assistants who are PhD students, Anna Dolores and Michelle Sue. And then Erin Martinez was with us for a while. She used to be with FYI. She now is a children's pastor at a local church. Our program director, Kayla Bruce, and myself. And one of the practices that I gotta stand up for a while. One of the practices that we've been trying to do with this project is to be intentional about sharing our learning with our team as we discover it, rather than wait till the end. Make it much more of a generative approach, because we think that does two things. One, it invites everybody into our process, and number two, it allows us to get feedback from the team as we continue to kind of figure out what we're trying to do with the project. And so we've done a couple of these, and they've been great fun. And it's developing a really great culture, I think, at FYI, because we have a lot of different projects going on, and it's really easy to kind of get in your own sort of world, and you don't know what anybody else is doing. Maybe you feel that like in your church sometimes, like you love what you do, but you have no clue what another ministry is doing, other than like once in a while you bump into each other. So I actually think I wish I would have had this maybe when I was doing pastoral ministry. Like, where are the places where we actually get to kind of share our learning or talk about our process or what we're developing, rather than just like, how did the retreat go? Good. Okay, next person, right? You know what I mean? So I do think there's a posture that comes of that. So what I want to do with all of you is do a bit of the same thing. Share with you some of the work that we're doing and the place that we're at with this. It's not finalized. We've got 4 years to do this. We've got a plan along the way to actually do some resourcing. But these first 2 years are really the research phase that we're about, and I'll explain that in a second. So one of the things that we're doing with this is our basic research question is this. What are the most prevalent transitions young adults ages 18 to 29 encounter as they negotiate an often less defined path from adolescence to adulthood? Now, those of you that have not been with us prior today, I won't hold it against you. You get a chance to hear more about this later. But I've talked in the past about emerging adulthood being the space in between adolescence and adulthood that is quite undefined and is very personal. Like you can't say someone's an adult. They almost have to self-identify as an adult. And the path to get from adolescence to adulthood, whatever that looks like, which is more vague, is a windy, crazy sort of ride filled with a meta transition of adolescence to adulthood, but also these meta transitions along the way. So one of the conceptual frameworks that we began to think about was this idea of transitions. Okay, I'll talk more about that in a second. Oh, that was good. Okay. I don't just happened. Okay. Oh yeah. And then the other thing we did is this: is as a team, we're like, research questions are not that sexy. Like, what would be a better way to actually talk about this? And so we started to say, well, what's our project's elevator pitch? Like, if we were in an elevator and somebody says, well, what do you do? Like, what would we say? So here's our elevator pitch. You know, imagine the elevator is like going from the fifth floor to the first right now. We're researching key transitions during young adulthood to resource ministries to effectively support young adults' spiritual quest for identity, belonging, and purpose. Okay, that's sort of the elevator pitch. And so this is what we've used as sort of the due north as we've thought about our research, and that's really important. Our DIO approach is really over these 4 years is to really begin to encapsulate, first of all, 4 deep values of FYI, and that is we do research in relationship to make resources, and we hope for results. Okay, so that's kind of what we do, and so we actually break down our project like by items, by research, relationships, resources, and then the results are just what happens of that. Like that's the way we sort of think about that. So we're trying to figure out in 2022 and a little bit of 23 what's the young adult ministry landscape, because one of the things we found out is that when we talk about young adult ministry, it's super vague. Like there's no like clear definition like youth ministry. There's things happening, but none of us know where. And this was a big deal for FYI. Like when we started doing resourcing, the big question to us was, well, who are you resourcing to? Like who is this for? How many are out there? Like 10? Like, or is there more? Like, do they need it? Does anybody care? Right? Like we actually have to think about that when it comes to results and profitability and all those other things, which don't sound very spiritual, but it is part of what we develop as far as sustaining. So what's the landscape? Who are the resourcers? So who are the influencers out there and how do we define that? And then what, and can we develop and promote? And then how will we strategically scale? And so this is sort of the process that we're in. So right now, we're really focusing on the landscape and we're starting to get a little bit of a picture of this as well. The conceptual framework, again, this is where you're taking these different topics and you're trying to bring them together, are a number of these things. Young adult and emerging adult research is a big piece of what we're doing. We've really focused in on this decade of transitions. It's not one transition, it's multiple transitions. And so this becomes a pretty deep and profound framework that we wanted to dig in a little bit more in, and I'll talk about that in a second. And we recognize the fact that transitions are practical, so they're felt in a deep and profound way. They're like the liminal space of a person growing up, spaces of growing up, which also have a deep and spiritual component as well. I mean, this is again what Joss is talking about a little bit. And I think transitions, we've discovered, are where young adults seek the most support. Like, where does someone look for help when they're in trouble? Like, if the tools that I've used to get to here don't get me to there, what do? I start looking for new ways to get to there, right? And so this is where they're actually looking for help and support. And so this is where we wanted to begin to look. And so the question that's raised for us is, how do faith communities use their resources? We believe they do have resources to support young adults where they say, where young adults say they need the most help. Okay, so we're not going to dictate what help they need. We're actually going to try to listen in these liminal spaces of where the greatest needs are, and then what can we do with the resources that we have as congregations, which we have a lot of resources, to actually help them. Okay, so this is the different pieces that we were trying to put together as we thought about our conceptual framework. With our research, we're taking a 3-pronged approach. We're looking at emerging adult and transitions literature. And so we put together a literature review, which I'll explain in a second, of like emerging adult literature and transitions. And like, what does that mean? Okay, you're going to get to see some of the future results of that. We also are putting together a young adult ministry ecology. And by this idea of ecology or landscape, it's actually looking basically in the United States. So this isn't broader than, it's not like the world, because we just wanted to start with the United States. I'm asking the question, who are the influencers? Organizations, individuals that those who do young adult ministry say they access to do their ministry. We just didn't know what was out there. And so we have a process that we did for that. So, and then we're also going to do, we're setting up to do a young adult national survey of young adults. This will be 1,000 young adults, a nationally representative sample that will be across the United States that will be followed up with interviews, particularly with young adults. Okay, so this is the work that we're doing. But we feel like if we can figure out transitions, if we can begin to map an ecology of where young adult ministry influencers are, and we begin to talk to influencers themselves, we can actually begin to triangulate this data, and we can actually begin to give some definition to what we're trying to see. It's pretty exciting. I'm really excited about it, actually. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, when it comes to transitions in the literature review, this is what we know. First of all, our research assistants put in over like 400 hours of research on this. Okay, so this is a lot of work. Okay, and I'm really proud of their work. They reviewed 75 peer-reviewed articles. So Josh did 50 today. 75. It's a pretty substantial amount of literature that we tried to look at. And this literature is everything from mostly social sciences and then also some religious literature as well. That's kind of what we basically looked at. It ended up being a 44-page report. I mean, it's like a pretty decent report of summarizing all these literatures, and we were trying to make sense of what we read. Okay, and then what we also are trying to do is we thought about the literature review is we constantly have in mind the United States 26's census projections, trying to make sure that we have a good representative, that our literature is represented well. Who's writing the literature? What are the populations that are studied and reported on? How do we think about that so that we don't just gravitate toward maybe a predominantly white sample of writers or of subjects, but we actually try to think about this. As you might imagine, this is trickier than just a chart. Number one, we haven't achieved this. This is our goal. And number two, sometimes you have perhaps a white researcher that's researching a different population, or you have an author that's looking at a particular population. And so this is a little bit tricky, but we are trying to make sure that as we look at our literature, people that are studied and those that are studying it and the topics that are there, it comes and begins to try to mimic our 2060 projections. Why 2060? Because that's where youth ministry is going. We could do 2020 projections or 2030 projections, but the reality is this is where we're headed. And so we want we think our research has more of a shelf life if we actually start anticipating where the population is going rather than playing it conservative. So this is obviously a goal that we have for that. When it comes to transitions, here's some things. Here's our definition of transition. It's a new, challenging, exciting, and disorienting experiences emerging adults encounter as they navigate life challenges and make choices to take responsibility for their lives and relationships. Okay, it's pretty broad. We wanted it that way. Another way to think about this is it's a time in an emerging adult's life where they're stopping and they're searching for a new way forward and they're starting again. Okay, so that's sort of a simple way to think about it. We're always thinking at FYI, I think about the research theory, and then we're always trying to think about like how are we going to explain this to somebody, right? So that's the second bullet's going to be easier than the first, right? As we've done more work on this, we've also added to this definition that these transitions may be experienced as gain and loss and also have an element of development and harmonization. So the first two are about experiences. The second two are more about agency. Okay, so I may experience something that happens in a transition, but then the agency is how I'm working through it. So when you ask an emerging adult, have you ever experienced racial discrimination? They might say yes, but then I think the deeper question is how are you thinking about working through that? How have you come to grips with that experience and what have you done, right? Some are like, no, I haven't done anything about it. Others are like, I've taken steps to move in that direction, right? So there's an experience that we have, but there's also there's sort of an element of agency associated with that as well. At least what we find from the literature review. What we're always keeping in the backdrop, because FYI is sort of committed to this idea of that in the midst of these transitions, there's a deep underlying current of their quests for identity, belonging, that there's a reason for living, that the point of transitions isn't just that it happens to them, but sometimes transitions happen because something dramatic has happened, or it's just them pursuing and trying to grow up, right? So I can actually have a deep and profound transitional experience because I took a new job at another city, or I decided to enter into a committed relationship, or I decided to say no to a behavior because I want to live a healthier lifestyle or whatever it might be, right? So these quests for identity, belonging, and purpose are always sort of in the background. But what we discovered through the literature review that we did is that there actually are 7 key transitions that seem to kind of bubble to the surface according to the literature. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean there are more than transitions than that. It doesn't mean that these are the only ones that are important. But of the research that's been done of emerging adults and our understanding of transitions, we saw 7 that really kind of popped to the surface. And I want to just take a minute and explain to you what we're seeing. Okay. These are them: identity, vocational, wellness, religious and spiritual, responsibility, geographical, institutional, and relational transitions. Okay, I'm going to give you a definition of each of these so you have a better understanding of what I mean by that. With identity transition, we're defining that as emerging adults' efforts to harmonize their multiple internal and external identities in order to live and embrace their authentic and true selves. Okay, so for an emerging adult, they have the capacity, actually the brain development, to be able to critically reflect on where they've come from, what makes them them, what parts do they want to hold on to and embrace, what parts do they want to let go of, and how do they begin to harmonize all these things. And so this is an important work that emerging adults are especially in their are going through in their 20s. Okay. But relational transitions are emerging adults' efforts to seek out and negotiate their various relationships, being vulnerable with some people and creating boundaries with others. Okay, so this is a place where an emerging adult is actually taking stock in their relationships and almost curating the type of relationships that they want to have. They finally have the agency to begin to do that. So in many ways, this is them opening up themselves to maybe new relationships or deeper relationships, romantic relationships, community, whatever might come with that. And it also means perhaps actually creating boundaries in some unhealthy family situations, or maybe a friendship that was in high school that it will always be there, but it only can go so far, right? There are just friendships that are like that, right? So again, we're like, well, of course, but for an emerging adult in their early 20s, this is like a significant moment where they have to make those choices. So these are transitions that they do. And so we call that relational transition. Vocational transition is emerging adults' effort to make meaningful contributions to the world and to provide for themselves and others. Okay, so this is them thinking about their investment in the world and what they want to do, not just individually, but communally as well. We found this in some of the literature as we think about different races and ethnicities, especially, that really value more of a communal way of living. This idea is not just about me finding the job of my dreams, but it's about how am I investing in my career, but also thinking about how that may make money to support those that I'm connected with. Okay, so that's the vocational choices associated with that. Geographical and institutional, we use both here, is emerging adults' efforts to adjust to unfamiliar geographical and/or institutional environments. So every environment has a culture. Whether I move to a new city and I'm trying to figure it out, or I enter into a corporate culture and I have to sort of figure out what my place is there, this can have a dramatic effect on the way I'm sort of adjusting to a new space that I have never been in before. So I may move across the country. I may not move anywhere, but I might be in a new job that actually has that happening to me. So, and it's not just a job. It could be a church. It could be a community that I'm a part of. I'm having to go to negotiate that. Even going to school, I'm negotiating what it means for me to be a part of this institution. So there's elements associated with that as well. Wellness transition, we saw a lot of this. Emerging adults' efforts to advocate for themselves by making healthy choices that ensure, improve, or recover their physical, emotional, and/or mental health. Okay, so there's a lot here. This one is a really tough one to define, but it's this idea of I'm taking responsibility for the choices that I'm making in my life to be a healthy person. That could mean riding the wave of good choices I've made before, or it could mean actually recovering from some of the choices that perhaps in my earlier 20s, I think, I ate a lot of junk food, or I drank a lot, or I didn't think of myself in a healthy way, or I'm realizing that there's more pressure on me mentally than I realized, and I have to change some of my thinking behaviors, right? So so this is their efforts to actually think about their wellness and to become healthier individuals as they take ownership of their lives. Responsibility transition is their efforts to gain agency, own their decisions, and adjust to increases in responsibility for their lives, relationships, and actions. Okay, this isn't far from some of the work that Arnett did, who wrote on emerging adulthood, of just this idea that one feels like an adult and they can make decisions for their lives on their own, right? They feel an ownership with that. Well, that doesn't just happen one day, right? There's a transition in multiple probably moments where they're negotiating what it means to have this increased responsibility, to own one's choices, to activate my agency, and to move in those directions. And so this idea of responsibility is something that comes up in the literature as well. And then spiritual and or religious transition. These are emerging adults' efforts to evaluate the religious and spiritual narratives they've inherited from parents and guardians or mentors and or faith communities, while constructing a worldview that is congruent with their emerging identity, belonging, and purpose. Okay, so two things are happening there. You have them taking stock in what they've inherited, right? Which is fine. We all inherit something. And trying to think about what that means from a religious perspective or a spiritual perspective. And then it's me figuring out, what am I leaving behind? What am I taking with me? And what am I developing? Okay. Now, in popular circles, we hear a lot of this idea of deconstructing, right? Like, oh, I'm deconstructing Twitter. Hey, everybody, I'm deconstructing. Yay. But actually what's happening is more like this, right? There's this renegotiating that's happening with what I've inherited and what I'm choosing to be. It's not this episodic moment. It can be dramatic at times, but it's actually this transition that one is going through to sort of become and own what they want to be about. Some in other literature that I've shared with you before, it's the difference between sort of an extrinsic motivation to an internal motivation, what making one's faith one's own, as we hear in religious circles, right? It's no longer just what someone tells me, it's something that I'm owning and accepting or rejecting and then building upon. And so we have this transition as well. So what we have here then are these 7 transitions that we think are really, really crucial. What's helpful, we think, with this is that there's a lot flying around with emerging adults. And I think the problem that we see with a lot of young adult ministries is they don't know where to begin, what to do. And so if we can begin to name the liminal spaces where emerging adults are perhaps wrestling the most and looking for the most help, and we're aware of it, we can begin to maybe touch on some of these things and help them along the way. Now, as we looked a little bit further and we pressed on this a little bit, and we thought about backgrounds, individuals, all those type of things, we recognized a couple of things. That sometimes these transitions aren't all the same sizes. Some are more dramatic than others. And so we'll give you a couple of examples of what we saw in the literature. We found, like, for immigrant and migrant emerging adults, their geographic institutional transition and responsibility and relational transition seemed to be more salient and important to them as they were sort of moving toward adulthood than some of the other transitions. Okay, there's probably lots of reasons for that. We don't have to necessarily get into that right now, but I find that fascinating. When it comes to LGBTQIA emerging adults, their identity transition and wellness and, again, relational transitions seem to play a bigger role than some of the other transitions. But you can see the dynamic sort of nature of this fact that even though these categories are here, one size doesn't necessarily fit all. When it comes to adverse childhood experiences, especially when it comes to attachment and things like that, again, you can see the relational, geographical, and wellness transitions playing a bigger role than some of the other transitions. And so, I think what I wanted to show you there was just how we've sort of taken this literature review and tried to understand what the transitions are, and use the literature review to come up with our own definitions so that we would define how we were talking about this, and then think about how this might actually help the way that we do ministry, as we recognize that there's a dynamic associated with it that we still need to sort of play with a little bit more. But there's some play in this model rather than it being too static or one size fits all or anything that comes with that. Now, in Canvas, as Drew mentioned, we have a glossary of all these transitional terms. So just so you know, it's there for you. This is a work in process. It's we call it our living document, so it's probably going to change. I would ask that you not go and train this and tell this is the latest thing that's coming out with FYI. This is much more of an internal document, but I think I trust you and I want to bring you in on this. I think it's important as we think about things. This will eventually come out, but this is our work in process. And I wanted you to see the process along the way. The glossary is really important. Not just to share with you, but as we keep talking about this, one of the hardest things about research is you can just run after so many rabbit trails, you forget what you're doing. So to define your terms, to kind of distill what you think is happening, provides these markers along the way that helps with that. So I have more to share, but I want to stop there and just ask you, what did you find interesting, or how do you think these initial findings inspire your own thinking or your work? So yeah, Josh.
Steve, can you expound if like a lot of your work in the past has been on struggle or spiritual struggle?
Yeah.
In particular with young emerging adults?
Yeah.
Is transition synonymous with struggle, or is struggle something that happens in these times?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know if I've even thought about that, Josh. So I really appreciate you saying that. I would say struggle is the experience emerging adults have. Transitions is the process that they're going through. So I can have multiple experiences with struggle as I work through my religious spiritual transition, right? And the point of transition, this I'm not exactly sure, but I'm working it out right now in my head. Transition isn't, the goal isn't just to get through it. The goal is to live well in it. See the difference? Because I don't know if I can guarantee, I don't know if we can guarantee as ministry leaders that we can get anybody through anything. That's the Spirit's process, right? Whether it's religious transition or some of these other ones. But we can live well in it. I think we can live poorly and we can live well in it, right? And I think we're trying to figure that out along the way as well. So maybe that's as best as I can say, Josh, right now. I think that's the way I make that distinctive, but I need to think about that more. I can't believe
I just sense that the struggle component, like these transitions are often those spiritual struggles.
Yeah, right. They're sort of interconnected. Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah, Jean Paul.
One thing I found helpful, I've been having conversations with people about that word deconstruction.
Yeah.
And how loaded it is, and how young people want to use it, and how, like, well, that doesn't mean what you think it means here. And some people are using it in a sense that's like, I'm walking away. Some people are using it, and so I think the language of the transition seemed helpful in that, and like even can speak into areas where there's been language that's being used unhelpful ways. And so I think, even helping young people see, oh, maybe what you're doing is not deconstructing, like don't, and then they're going down the rabbit hole of how to deconstruct Google, and then getting all these resources that will be probably unhelpful, versus someone coming alongside and be like, here's some things that could be I found that language really helpful at that moment.
Thanks. And we're going to test to see if transitions is the right word with young adults, because I think we want to find language for that. But if I were to push on deconstructing, and when I think about it in transition terms, that only feels like the experience side. It feels very passive. I suppose I could like try to deconstruct, but true deconstructing, there has to be a reconstruct.
Right.
Like you don't deconstruct into oblivion. Like, we all have to hold on to something, right? So, I don't care if people use the word deconstructing, but I think it's more of trying to understand what they mean by that rather than freaking out about it, because I think it's just kind of a sexy word right now, quite frankly, rather than really what's kind of going on. So I really appreciate that, because I think we're trying to find the language. Yeah, Josh.
I find it interesting that even though this is targeted to 18 to 29-year-olds, when I think of my 15 and 16-year-olds, this extends down partially to what they're going through. Maybe not to the same extent as somebody going off to college or changing careers. I know that's not your focus.
No,
for
I
this project.
that. So here's how I'd answer that. I wonder if some of the similar transitions work for teenagers, or if the bubbles are different. I think the part that I'm not sure about is I don't know at 15, 16, if they actually have the capacity to use agency as well as a 20-something. because their brains aren't developed. They're still sort of becoming in so many ways that I don't think that's quite as strong. It doesn't mean they don't have agency, but I think it's a little bit different. So I think that would be really interesting, you know, and it's outside the scope of this project, but I think if we get a hold of this, I think it begs the question, like, well, if these transitions are happening in 20, can we anticipate it earlier?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have a long-term perspective, knowing these are
Yeah.
coming.
Yeah.
How to help our youth.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, I love that. Thank you for that. Yeah. Jim.
What's the role of non-transition in the midst of these transitions? Like, I guess another way of thinking about it is like, if someone isn't transitioning through one of these 7,
Yeah.
is there healthy adulthood if people aren't renegotiating their relationships and their boundaries? Is there healthy adulthood at the end if people are not thinking about their living and working environments in new ways? Like if there's a continual line that goes through. And the reason I ask this is that I think that I'm seeing more and more people not just living with their parents in college or for a couple years after college, that like we have in our congregation like 27, 28, 29-year-olds, they're still living with their parents, and like there's a non-transition that's happening there.
Yeah.
And like there's kind of like no end in sight kind of living there.
Yeah.
So I'm just like wondering, I'm like, what is that, the role of non-transition in that?
My assumption is if you want to make it to adulthood, there has to be something happening. So non-transition would be diffuse, like the inability to develop, you know, and it could be just delayed. I mean, maybe, you know, some emerging adult literature is pushing into the 30s now. I mean, they're, you know, again, we're looking at this age range, but it could push. But it seems as though I don't know if a human being has the luxury to always live at their parents' house forever. At some point, I mean, if I've been really crass, parents are going to die and they're going to have to own something. So at some point, like agency has to happen at some level.
Yeah.
I can't imagine any of us have had conversations where someone's not trying to make their lives a little bit better or work through something. So that I think there's something like that with transition. I don't know why it's like kids living with their parents for a really long time, if they're just afraid or they feel paralyzed in some sort of way. But we know that's not the end. That there's something there. So so the ministry question is, well, where do they need us the most in that? Do they need courage? Do they need support? Do they need scaffolding? Do they need a way forward? Do they need a halfway house? You know, what do they need to kind of help them get there? Because I do think the ethic is they have to figure out how to live on their own and own these different pieces in their lives, because they can't be dependent on somebody else to constantly be their external motive. Like at some point you have to own your life, right? I mean, that's what adulthood is, right? So if we care about social capital and we care about our society raising people that can contribute to society, it seems like there's a deep ethic that we're contributing to even as a church to do that. So, you know, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but you know, I mean, I don't think that a person can stay there.
Sure.
I actually think they'll die there. I mean, like maybe not physically, but like human. Like, you know what I mean? Like they're so stuck, so paralyzed. So yeah, it's an interesting thought. Yeah.
Just off the, like that example again, like the moving out of home is very individualistic, white Western pursuit.
Yeah.
You know, like there's people for whom staying at home is the correct and right pursuit of adulthood.
Right.
So it'd be fascinating to see how these key transitions translate into contexts where actually the responsibility of the eldest daughter is to actually stay at home.
Yeah.
And that she would get married, but stay at home. You know, like, and what does that look like? How does that actually operate within this dynamic of these transitions?
So we were pretty careful not to have living at home as the transition,
I was
but
just
it is.
using it because that.
Yeah, but I think the relational transition is really key there. Of like, what does it mean for me to be a married woman that lives at home with as a family, and where's permission giving and where are boundaries, right? I mean, and culturally that's going to be different, but there's still a negotiating that happens there. And social domain theory talks a lot about that, right? So So there's something that's going on there where I'm still becoming, right? But I think that's a great example of, we can't assume living at home is like the measure for making it or not. Yeah.
So I thought of something as we were talking about these, and we're always trying to get the older adults in church to understand, right?
Yeah.
But I see a lot of these happening in older adults, right? I mean, they're doing these same kind of transitions. What does vocation look like for me now that I don't have one? What does relationship look like when all my friends are dying?
Yes.
What does a geographic or institution mean for me? Do I have to move someplace closer to one of my kids, or have to go? So I think that what's fascinating thing about this is it's a way to share communication with another generation that's doing different kinds of, but the same kind of transitions.
Yeah, I love that. I think this can be a conduit for empathy.
Me too.
I also think the shadow side is it can be a barrier to empathy, because I think some older adults would be like, well, I'm going through that and I'm not freaking out like you are. The difference with the emerging adult is they're experiencing it for the first time.
I disagree with the fact that they're not freaking out.
Yeah, well, but I wonder if they still have more brain and resource capacity to do something about it. More money, more power, more, you know what I mean?
Some do.
Yeah, some don't, sure, yeah.
But I mean, I'm just saying that's a point of conversation,
Yes.
right? I mean, you can talk to a young person who's saying, I'm really struggling with, this situation, and older adult can say, well, I'm struggling in this way. They can share their struggles, even though
Absolutely.
you're right that they probably have more, and more experience.
Yeah, right.
So with experience comes.
Yeah,
They just
exactly.
They never did the transition.
Yeah, but I love
30
that.
years later.
Yeah, but I do love the fact that there's conduit for conversation. I love the way.
I mean, when you talk about the middle people, right, those 30, 40, 50, however old we're gonna go, right? I mean, they're really just kind of doing teeny transitions, right? Livable, kind of transitions, but they become much more larger.
Yeah.
You become older.
Yeah, well, that's true too. That's true too. Yeah, Taylor.
So y'all have just in the midst or have just finished the literature review process, correct? And so does the research that y'all are planning on doing seek to kind of shed more light on what these actual big transitions look like? Is that just wanted to make sure I understand the goal?
Yes,
Okay.
I'll tell you in a second.
Okay, sorry.
It's a great transition.
Okay.
The literature review is important because we wanted to know kind of what Joss talked about this morning. We wanted to know what was there.
Mhm.
It shows us what's there and what's not. It answers some questions, it raises some more, right? It aligns us with the conversation so that we're not talking out of the blue, right? So it's the discipline that you're all going to do in your final work to just basically say, here's the area that I'm playing in, here's who's talking about it, right? So that's what we tried to do with the literature review. And then we've got work to do there, but I'm going to share a little bit of that in a second. Yeah, Kelsey.
So back to the conversation of, looking towards the future in 2016.
Yeah.
I wonder what COVID has done and looks like with these transitions, and especially like the relational one, right?
Yeah.
Like, what does that mean and look like for youth who are now going to come up into this emerging adulthood?
Right.
And have completely different transitional experiences because they grew up in a COVID and post-COVID world that interacts different.
Yeah, this is a great question. I mean, we're just kind of stuck in a world where we have to deal with it. And I mean, if you look at our large report, I mean, we list that as a limitation of, we don't know what this means. Like, this obviously is having a dramatic effect. It makes some of the literature feel a little obsolete, even if it's not that old. But we can't wait. Like, what's like the cool down period before we can start researching again? You know what I mean? Like, we just have to keep doing it, recognizing that that's a huge piece. But you're right. I think it could have a dramatic effect on this. I mean, it could create a whole new transition of just crisis, or maybe we're going to see it influencing all of these transitions. But that's like an unknown question. But it's a really insightful comment.
How does mental health play into those pieces? I was curious because even gosh, just recently having now a college graduate and stuff, and
Yeah.
then hearing her experiences and others with their experiences, that even with dealing with any anxieties or whatever, how now you have psychiatrists and other people offering all kinds of pills to college students who are getting addicted to opioids, just like senior citizens are, and how that causes these delays in so many ways. And I think of some of my friends who serve in colleges that are in the mental health field, who talk about the rise of this escalating rise of these cases, and how they, everything's changed because of that.
I think it's a great question. I mean, we tried to capture it in the health transition, mental health being one of them that they have to realize and recognize and figure out how they're going to work through. And again, the literature review just kind of shares what the studies are.
Yeah,
We don't, I don't know, but I think it's a really important question. Because these all sort of affect each other, right? I mean, these aren't like separate transitions. And they're multiple. You don't go through them once. I mean, you can go through them 10 times. Can I keep going? Okay, so great. Everybody doing okay? Do we need to stand up, sit down? We're doing okay? Okay, sorry, he's standing up. So if you want to stand up, feel it. We're almost there. I don't know why you're just not so excited about that. I can tell you why. Okay. I'll keep going. So we took this a little bit further. We did that work, came back, did some more work. And as you remember, like we came up with these 7 transitions. And this is really the first square. The youth ministry ecology is the other piece that we were working on. And so I want to share a little bit about that. This hasn't happened yet. I almost have the proposal done. It's going to the institutional review board, which is so much fun. And we're going to get that approved. But right now we're looking at that. So when we think about the ecology, here's what we did. We did a young adult leaders survey. And we identified through it was more of a convenient sample. These are churches that have been connected with FYI. That 92 people that identified as a young adult leader responded to. And they identified, when we asked them, what resources do you access to do your young adult ministry? They identified 79. Okay, so we tried to boil them down. And if they, like you and I both said, I don't know, youth specialties, which doesn't exist anymore or whatever, that would just count as one, right? So we had 79 unique ministries. We also did another survey. It was a market research survey that we did. It was a broader survey that FYI did. But one of the questions we asked is that if you did young adult ministry, what resources did you access? They gave us 49 resource types. 26 were the same as the first wave, so we added another 23 to that. Okay, so they're doing. The third thing we did is our research assistants, we had them scour the web and look for ministries that actually did young adult ministry, and that was like their main focus. Okay, and we came up with another 76 unique ministries for that. So when we put the total unique ministries together, we came up with 178 young adult ministries in the country that were influential ministries. How do we define influential? I'm not exactly sure. It basically comes down to this. They were usually individuals or organizations that other people said they accessed for their work. They usually were organizations. In fact, we were pretty sure about this. Their goal was to not only just research, say, their own church, but also to research a broader constituency. So these weren't just individual churches doing things. They actually had a program or a curriculum or video or podcast or something where they said our goal is to resource young adult ministry in some way, shape, or form. Okay, pretty loose, but still trying to have something beyond like I have a young adult group and I do curriculum. That doesn't really count. So that's how we define what an influencer was. Could be an individual, could be an organization. Okay, so 178 came of that. Now, what we did then is we superimposed, we looked more deeply at the 178 individuals and organizations, and we asked the question, so what's your content? Like, what did you address? in this content generally, okay? We looked at the website, we looked at some of their materials, we tried to figure that out. And what we discovered was this, is that of the 178, the top 3 transitions that they addressed were the religious spiritual transitions, the relational transitions, and the vocational transitions. The transitions they did not address were the other 4: identity, wellness, geographical responsibility. Okay, so of the 7 transitions, not even half, I suppose you can't have half, only 2 of 7 were addressed by these 178 organizations. Okay, so here's a gap in the literature, right? We know that there are some organizations out there doing young adult ministry. We're going to learn more about them as we do work, though, but most of their curriculum and efforts were here and not here. Okay, so what does that say? I don't know. It's interesting. I mean, if the totality of an emerging adult experience includes these 7 transitions in some way, shape, or form, but 4 of the 7 aren't being addressed, perhaps we need to actually think about what ministries might be, growing in that. Yeah.
Of your, I think 178 was the total number.
Yeah.
Were you just looking at faith-based resources? So if I'm in adult ministry, I'm pulling from like 12 different resources. 10 of them might be faith-based, but 2 of them might be non-faith-based.
Yeah. These were Christian, and the list was bigger. So like some had like Kristen Tibbetts on beat. Well, her mission isn't to do young adult ministry. That's not what she does, even though there's, some would say they access it, which I think is great, but she didn't make the list. Cool. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, so these would be Christian individuals or organizations. So anyway, so this is a finding. So this raises some really interesting questions for us. Like, so how do we think about transitions, and how do we think about the way they're being addressed right now? There's some gaps. There's also some good work being done. And so this is going to help us sort of figure out who do we need to talk to that are doing these as we think about resourcing and collaboration and things like that. How are they resourcing? Well, the most influential resource kinds that we came up with was some sort of training, resources, a lot because of our convenient sample addressed our hub, our young adult initiative, or the Maya, so that's a little bit skewed. Campus ministry and missions. Honorable mentions were congregations, conferences, a leader, an influencer, or some form of education. But you can kind of see these are sort of the ways that they were trying to deliver this material. We don't have any much more on it than this, but there's some more definitions there that you can kind of see where it's going. So what we think with regards to this is that, I think that the ecology work started with a convenient sample of FYI connected young adult ministry leaders. And so our goal is to expand and to develop the young adult ministry landscape. We think there's more than 178. We think there's certain populations that will preference certain resources over others. And there's just much more work that we have to do here. But you just have to remember, like, we started with a blank slate. It's like putting a map on the wall and it's blank and you're like, there's no pins on it, right? And we're trying to put the pins and trying to just kind of figure out, like, what does the landscape look like? How do we begin? Who do we talk to? Like, who do we get together, right? These are the types of questions that we're trying to ask. So we've got more work to do with that. And then our goal then is to eventually identify young adult ministry influencers. Well, let's see, is to understand, their focus and expertise with these transitions so that we can gather focus groups. Like, if we can get people to gather around a particular transition and say, how are you teaching it? What are you hearing? What are you discovering? What's helpful? We can actually find best practices and actually begin to create maybe some sort of resource list that actually helps with that and maybe develop some new stuff along the way. So we're finally getting to the point where maybe we can actually get ministries to talk to each other that have no idea that even they exist. You know what I mean? So I'm super excited about that. But that's sort of the big view. There's one more thing I want to share with you. And then there's a smaller view that we kind of look at. And this is really important. And this is to do more with those that we're serving from an FYI perspective. The big question that we had at FYI is, who is the young adult leader? Who are they? What do we know about them? Like, how do we know we're helping them? Just because I write a book doesn't mean that anybody exists to read it. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't even matter. And so we had to ask some really hard questions. And it's much different than youth ministry. where the youth leader is a little more traditional. It's a little bit more defined. It's certainly changing and there's nuances and everything else. But when I say youth ministry leader, you have a pretty good sense in your mind of what we're talking about, right? You know what I mean? Because it's just more defined. If I say young adult ministry leader, I bet you I had come up with 10 different definitions in this around this table, right? So the challenge for us at FYI is to figure that out because it really does shape the type of resourcing, right? So and we started this a little bit with the Maya project. It showed up in the book, Young Adult Ministry Now, but we've taken this a bit further. So just a couple of things. When we think about young adult ministry, when we think about FYI's audience, the biggest audience that we have as far as customers would be who? Youth pastors, right? Okay. Who do you think is second? Children, parents, or senior leaders, right? This is usually what comes up. It's actually young adult ministry leaders.
Wow.
It's 16%. Okay. So this is great because I'm excited about it. I'm like, yeah, there's a lot out there. We should be helping them. So our latest survey, we found that 16% of them would say that they do some sort of young adult ministry. So 16 doesn't seem like a lot, but in comparison, like senior leaders at FYI is 5%. Okay. Yeah.
Exclusively, or maybe they might do youth and.
Youth and.
Okay.
Yeah, could do both. Of our constituency, 38% were BIPOC, multiracial congregations, so this is a white thing. Their annual budget, we have a third that have no budget. We have about 2/3 that have 1,000 to 5,000 for their budget, and then only about a little over 10% have over 5,000 for their budget. So even if we look at all of that, that's not a lot of resource for young adult ministry. You know, even the smallest church, you know, probably would be on the upper end of this thing in youth ministry, right? Generally. So there's not a lot of money here. So so that's an interesting finding for us as well, right? So it's like, come to our, you know, our $3,000 cohort, stay for a week and learn everything. They're like, I can't blow my yearly budget, man. I can't do it. Yeah.
And that's not, is that including salary of the person?
No. This is just like, this is like ministry budget.
Okay.
Like, yeah, I mean, salary would be benefits. I mean, that would be different.
Okay.
Yeah. But I'll show you more about that in a second. The average young adult ministry leader focuses on young adult ministry 12.5 hours a week. Right. Yeah. Okay. So it's what, a quarter time.
Yeah.
That's the average. Okay. So this is really important for us at FYI, is just to remember, like, young adult ministry leaders aren't thinking about young adult ministry all the time. They have another job in ministry, or it's volunteer or whatever. Well, that shapes how I think about them and what they can do, right? Like a 400-page tome on young adult ministry, they're probably not going to read it, right? So what do we do about that, right? So another interesting finding. A couple of things, they're divided by role. As we did research, we found that only about 13% are young adult ministry leaders alone. Most of them are youth leaders that do young adult ministry. Maybe some of you are even in that camp. And then associate senior family pastors, 48 are young adult ministry leaders. So somehow of these 48 are there. How do these stats work? Young adult, those that identify as young adult ministry leaders, there were 13%. I don't know how the percentages work now.
Only the top one is exclusive.
What's that?
Only the top one is exclusive. So like I would fit into
right.
number 2 and 3.
Yeah, so yeah, exactly right. So anyway, you can kind of see it's just sort of interesting, but this is really important because I think we're just realizing, okay, as we begin to conceptualize who young adult ministry leaders are, they're not just like bigger youth leaders, right? They're people that are holding a lot of different things and trying to figure some things out. So what do we do about that? Well, what we did is we looked at our data, we thought about the literature, and we came up with 3 personas of what we think like a young adult ministry leader looks like. Now, these aren't the only ones, but sometimes you just have to begin to give a face and a name to like who you're actually trying to serve, right? I mean, which is a great thing to just do with ministry in general, right? Like, who actually are we serving? Like, what do they look like? And like, based on what we know of that, what can we do about it? So our first person is full-time Felicia, or Felicity. She's 35. She has a bachelor's degree. She's at a traditional church of about 450 people. She's got about 70 young adults, and her title is Director of Young Adult Ministry. Okay.
she'd say, I love serving young adults, but also wish there were more resources available for this kind of ministry. I have to make it up as I go along. Okay. Her goals are to build her young adult community, help young adults build relationships with older adults, and bridge the gap between youth group and young adult congregation. That's just that's what we found. Her frustration is her supervisor really don't understand what young adults need. Young adults are transient and it's real, so it's hard to build a consistent community because they're coming and going. And I don't know anyone else doing this kind of work, and they need more ministry. Okay, so there's a sense of isolation that Police City has as well. So then we have a story for each one of these. In addition to running the Sunday night young adult service, I've been texting young adults in our community every week and doing regular one-on-ones to support young adults and what they're going through. However, my supervisor told me I should focus more on events to draw bigger crowds, even though that's not what our young adults need or want. Okay, so you can kind of feel the tension that she feels that she's working at this church, right? So again, how do we help her? Like, that's the question, right? How do we serve? Another one. We've got youth leader Peter. He's 33. He's got a bachelor, non-denom church, about 250. He's got 20 young adults, and he's the youth and young adult director. Probably they tagged on young adult just because they didn't know what else to do. So I care about my youth group graduates, but it's hard to support them when youth ministry is still my main focus, right? So whereas his energy is in youth ministry, goals to help young grads know that they still belong to church, bridge the gap between the youth group and the adult congregation, and get the church to prioritize young people everywhere, including often forgotten young adults. Their frustrations that even though my supervisors agreed to adding young adults to my title, he only ever asked about the youth group. I don't have enough time or resources to serve them well. And so his story is, I told some recent young adult graduates that they still belong to the church and can still come to the youth group if they want. One replied, I don't want to be your youth ministry leftovers. It's sad, but I understand why he feels that way. Our church needs to do more to not say they care about young adults, but to show it. Okay, so that's sort of his angst, right? Some similarities as Police City, but different. And then we have Wide Angle Will. He's 45. He's got his MDiv. He's in a Protestant church, about 350. He's got about 30 young adults, and he's the pastor of families and small groups. Okay, so he sort of has that family pastor role. I care about young adults, but they're not my only focus. I want to help young adults transition to life in church, support parents of young adults, plug young adults into small group ministry, and possibly start a mentoring ministry for young adults. He'd love to do that, at least that's his goals. But his frustrations are young adults come and go and rarely commit, though they want community. I'm not sure our church culture is hospitable enough to young adults, and I need more guidance on how to disciple young adults well. And so his story is, my senior pastor is still holding on to the vision that young adults will meet each other at church, get married, and have kids that they'll raise in the church. The young adults I know are unlikely to fit this picture, that I'm not sure what alternative vision to provide that offers, that better captures young adults' place in the church, okay? So again, I think what we're trying to do with these composites, these personas, is just to try to capture the internal dialogue that they're having. Perhaps we can show empathy, and that actually will shape the way we think, not only about the research that we're doing, but the resources that we're trying to produce.
Can I ask a practical question? Sorry, is it more likely for a church to have a youth group than a young adults ministry?
Yes,
okay.
At least in the States, yeah.
Yeah.
These three personas, there's paid staff. They're paid positions.
They're paid positions, yes.
Okay.
So we don't have a volunteer one. Yeah, which, well, this is where it gets hard, because for FYI, I mean, we're a resourcing organization, right? So if we give resource, like somehow we can do some things for free, but it's not really sustainable unless we get a grant of some sort to do that. So, yeah. So what do we want to do? We're going to expand the ecology that I mentioned before. We're going to survey young adults with this. We're going to sort of test some of the ideas that we're doing, and then we're going to collaborate with influencers. And really begin to test these personas and these transitions on all these different entities to try to get more clarity and sort of really test their hunches. Like maybe young adults are going to be like, yeah, we really don't care about those 7 transitions. You know, really the the top 4 are these, right? We might, or we'll discover there's something that we haven't realized before. So part of our job is to begin to really kind of to test our ideas against other things to try to see what's real and what becomes clear and how we can actually help churches think about this. Yeah.
So you created those composites based just on the market survey that you.
The market surveys, and then also through our Maya research, we had over 100 industry leaders and young adults that were part of that. So we've got a lot of data from those conversations. So yeah. So it's market data, and it's a bit of our experience wrapped into that as well.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Steve, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Like the 2 different terms you're using of young adults and emerging adults.
Yeah.
Are you interchangeably using those, or are you defining emerging adult in a different way, or are you dropping the use of?
I apologize for that. So I want to call everything emerging adults because I feel like it's the best term.
Right.
I think most ministries don't understand emerging adults, and so we use young adults. Lily uses young adults, so I will gladly call it young adults.
Give me your money.
Call it young adults.
So why emerging adults?
What's that?
Why emerging adults for you?
I think it's more accurate describing their experiences, and Arnett would say that emerging adults is actually what emerging adults like to be called more than young adults. So I lean toward what people want to self-identify as. I just don't think a lot of them have that language. And young adult can mean a lot. I mean, depending on culture, it can mean everything from like you're not married yet, right? So that could go up to the 40s, right? Emerging adulthood is much more focused on the 3rd decade of life, at least at this point. So I think to be more particular and more accurate in academic settings, I want to use emerging adulthood. I think in ministry settings, I'm transposing just because they understand young adulthood. So that's how I'm using it. If I was consulting them, I would push them further to make sure that they would be clear on what they mean by young adult and introduce emerging adulthood. But there's just some things where I almost use it synonymous just because I'm moving from academic to ministry and back again. So I'm just trying to transpose.
Yeah, it's interesting because they're now sitting at a slightly different thing, but like so emerging leaders is something that our denomination is using at the moment, and every young leader that I've talked to about that as a tag for them, they hate the word emerging.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
That's interesting.
And they can't give me an alternative, like they don't really know what, but like they think it doesn't speak to the fact that they are already leaders.
Okay, which would be the difference, because this is where it would be different. I was just gonna say this, is that I think they're young leaders, they're inexperienced leaders that are leaders in their own right.
Yeah.
Where when someone says they're a young adult, they're saying, I'm not an adult, I'm not even a young one.
Yeah, right.
But I'm in this in-between phase where I'm becoming, and I want to be an adult, but I'm not there yet. So the emerging in that sense has a feel of process.
Yeah.
And that's okay, right? So you know what I mean? So I think that might be the difference.
Yeah.
I see why that would be annoying if like you're an almost leader.
Yeah.
You know, like that would be offensive, with some leaders.
But it's sort of the same in terms of you're almost an adult.
Yeah.
Which is, in terms of the research, like, we kind of would say you are almost an adult, but it's also.
People want to be a leader. Not everybody wants to be an adult. They're like, I don't know about that.
And I mean, I don't really like either term, to be quite frank, but like, I don't know what alternatives.
And even emerging, I mean, you think about it like decades ago, like emerging church and things like that. I mean, emerging's been around for a while.
Yeah, I was just curious as to,
So I just think young adults, you're still an adult even if you're young. An emerging adult is that you're not an adult yet. You're emerging toward adulthood. That would be the distinction in its perfect form. In ministry, I think it's a mixed bag. I don't really feel like I have to fight it. I don't think I can. I think most churches just call them young adults. So.
And in the end, you just go where the money is.
And go with the money.
Sweet.
Sorry. I know.
Is there any distinction in what you guys are doing as you're talking to ministry leaders between college ministry leaders and young adult ministry leaders?
Same question. So Lily is from a research standpoint, Lily's more interested in post-college.
Okay.
So they are most interested in 23 to 29.
Okay.
It said 18 there.
I know, because I'm interested in 18. So this is where I'm not only taking the money, but I'm making it my own. So I'll talk to Lily about 23 to 29, but I'll talk to others. I think the problem with, like, college ministry is a different animal.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, there's scaffolding, there's attention, student development, it's such a developed field that in some ways churches kind of get it, and I don't know how much we have to contribute to that. But I think the post-college, or at least the 23 up, is more mysterious.
Right.
And so that's where we're focusing our efforts. But I just don't think we can ignore the early emerging adulthood experience, because number one, not everybody goes to college. Number two, less and less are doing a traditional college experience, whatever traditional is anymore, right?
Yeah.
So even that is becoming more diffuse. So I think my prediction is that there's going to be more work that's going to need to be done on college age, early 20s experiences, because they're becoming more diverse than ever before. Before, I mean, before it was almost binary. Like you went to school or you worked. Like what was, you know, and now, and it was only for 4 years. It's kind of like adolescence, right? Like traditional college is like 6 years now, right?
Yeah.
And then what is, you know, what does community college look like? What is student development associated with that, right? I mean, there's just so many different ways to cut it out.
I find it interesting that we used to look at it kind of like, oh, you tick these certain boxes, you're an adult now, right? You either got married, you had a kid, you got a job, you're an adult now. Versus now it is more of a, like you said, you have to like self-identify as an adult. Or like, I'm adulting right now, but I'm not an adult yet, but I'm doing adult things.
Right.
Instead of just, well, you did that, so now you're an adult.
Yeah, well, and I think the problem is that there was a time externally where society was more in agreement. So it was easier to adopt society's definitions because they were clear. Now that there isn't any clarity, what do? Well, I have to define it for myself because no one else is going to define it for me, right? So it's moved from the external to the internal. You know, I'm sure like 20, 40 years ago, someone felt like an adult, but it was easier to feel like one because society recognized you as one, because you checked the boxes, right? Now those boxes don't matter. So that's created ambiguity and a lot of challenge.
Do you think that will contribute to some emerging adults, maybe compared to their peers? So I think of like a couple that gets married young.
Yeah.
Their peers aren't getting married till they're 28, 29. They got married at 22, 23. And all of a sudden, all right, I'm an adult now because I've marked something that I found that sometimes with even at our church where we'll get a young married couple.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, you're younger than half our young adult group, but I don't know where to put you because you don't think you're a part of that group anymore. But in every other respect, or like in two of the categories, you moved across the country and you're married.
Yeah.
But you just, you're so young. We don't have, where do we put you? And then do we put you with older married? It's kind of, there's like kind of a tension of like, they check 2 off. So now they move, but there's all these other ones below that they're still maybe with an older group.
So I think those are just, I think it's a really honest tension. I think we have to be careful not to assume that just because they're married that they think they're adults. They're young, they're still going through some transitions. And so maybe the essence of what young adult ministry isn't about marriage status, it's more about life experience, right? Because my guess would be that a newly married couple is going through relational transitions as they figure out what it means to be a couple and not be so integrated into maybe their families of origin. I don't just think that. You know what I mean? So for me, it gives you as a pastor more latitude and more freedom to address this than trying to figure out, do I put them with single people or not? You know what I mean? Like that just seems to break down really quickly. And quite frankly, I just think they're living in a world where their friends are married and not, living together and not, right? So they're already living in that kind of world. Why are we trying to separate them because of, say, marriage, marital status? I don't think that's as helpful anymore. They might say, we feel like adults. So put them with other older couples that are working on marriage and that's what they want to work on. Well, that's fine, but you're honoring sort of their wishes of formation rather than feeling like you need to put them somewhere or feel a responsibility for that. You know what I mean? So I would hope something like this would give you more freedom rather than make it more confusing. But yeah.
Yeah.
So on your layout with like 250 in the congregation and then like 20.
Yeah.
I'm like, that's, did you use that based on numbers or you just make that up? Because I'm like, 20 young adults would be amazing if there's, church of 250.
Well, yeah, I mean, they're just snapshots. I mean, and I don't even know, like, I think the other thing, some deeper questions, I think it's a great question. Some deeper conversations we're having is, well, what does it mean to be connected with a church? I mean, I cannot tell you how much ink was spilled on our survey that we're putting together of how do we ask somebody about their connection to church? Like, is it coming on Sunday mornings? Is it preferably showing up? Is it once a month? Is it like how do we gauge like your connection with church, right? So I think what you're seeing there are probably the most optimistic numbers that somehow they're orbiting the church and they think they've got 20 around. You know what I mean? So
I'm just like, I'd be happy if there's 2.
Yeah, well, you have that too.
I'm also in
right?
SoCal, so it's
Yeah,
just.
Depends on.
Yeah, right.
Something, sorry.
Yeah.
Something that we almost feel, I think that you mentioned in one of the people's descriptions, the transient nature of young adults, that we almost feel like we're almost like a waypoint on a journey where the young adults who are coming to us it's almost a whole, with the seven circles, their map looks wholly different than the young adults who are going to Soul City down in the heart of Chicago. And so there's a pretty well trodden path of kids will go to Soul City and then they'll go to college, they'll come back, they'll go to Soul City, then they'll come to us. And it's just kind of like bouncing away where more than any other age demographic, there almost is this kind of like journey points where churches may be naming, all right, here's where we are demographically loosely. So a lot of kids for us. It's a lot of people who are back very successfully, like we did it, or earlier, and with more pain because some of their transitions haven't gone as they hoped.
So maybe the question for you is, why are they back? You know, what is the thing they're working through that they feel like you're sort of a waypoint for lives? My guess, and this is all I'm focused on right now, I bet it has something to do with transitions. They're looking for some sort of reliable resource to help them navigate some aspect of their lives. You know, and they haven't found it in these other places, but your church has been a consistent space that they seem to trust for some reason. Maybe your presence, because you've been there for a long period of time, whatever, that they want to come back to and tap into. And so I think we miss the opportunity if all we do is we celebrate them being back. The question is, why are they back and what do they need, you know? And how can we resource that, right? Where do we have to show up where they say they need us the most, right? That's the $1 million question. Otherwise, I think we just guess, or we assume that they're back to stay, or we're just happy that they're, you know, not our church and not your church, you know, or whatever, and you're too holy to think like that. But you know what I'm saying? Like, we stop short of the deeper question because we're just happy to have them back. That's like, we have to understand what that means. Like, what is that moment? Like, what's going on there, right?
Well, I think what I need to poke to is, I think there's a common a common church growth model mindset that we have. Where like, if we can just get the young people, then they're going to be there, they're going to stay, and like that's going to be the next generation. When the older generation water falls off, we have this next thing. If your research can open the door to having more conversations about what is it like for us to be the church general and live in those transitions with our people and not put that weight on this whole on our leaders or on our kids to say, hey, you have to be this next generation, but honoring here's a transition space where you are and we're going to be here with you in it, and disconnecting them from the weight of the growth of the church for the next generation.
Oh my gosh, you're speaking the language. Yeah. I think we're going to have to fight capitalism for that. Seriously, like, I mean, right? Because now it's an issue of territory, it's an issue of numbers, it's an issue of preservation, right? And what you're talking about is an issue of transition, of almost, I write in the other young adult book, I mean, to be the exchange zone of a triathlon life, right? We're not the destination, we're a key piece along the way in their pilgrimage, right? That's a different mentality of the way we use our resources, or how we train people, or what we pastor, or how we view our church, right? And this is exactly what you're saying. And but that's a huge paradigm shift.
I think your research opens the door a little in naming some of those key transitions, because on different waypoints, the transitional like formula looks so distinctly different that you can, it starts to give language to, oh, here's where this community of kids are coming from. And there is a journey that they're still on.
Yeah. Yeah, I think for some, I don't know where this is gonna go. There's part of me that like at first think churches are gonna be like, oh, this is great. We got a curriculum. And then they're gonna realize what it's gonna cost them. And they're gonna be like, oh, I hate you, Steve. Like, that's what I think is gonna happen. Because I think kind of like with growing young, right? We're asking churches to become something different, not just deliver something different, right? And that, I mean, Grace, it gets back to your question, and Amanda, what you were talking about, like the deeper questions of our literal existence are on the line, if we really want to be honest, right? And those are fighting words. We're not talking about little things anymore. Now we're talking about reimagining education, right? Rethinking practices in our traditional churches, reimagining what if mega churches should even exist, right? Like, I mean, those are not messing around, right? Reimagining, college, right? I mean, so anyway, figure it all out, red paper, do a dissertation, turn it in, graduate, it'll be great.
3 months.
So anyway, I'll just stop there with that. I appreciate you giving me a chance to share it. It actually helps me to talk it out because it's pretty fresh. And I appreciate the questions and some of the things that you just sort of made object from me. I'm going to take that back and think about it. So I'll keep sharing. You can tell me what you think. And if you have ideas later, like send them my way. Like I'd love to tap into that. And as we move towards this next phase of hopefully gathering some views together, you may hear from me because I'd love to hear what you think. So, okay, I'm gonna let you go, but first what's happening tonight? Dinner on your own. Andy and I are gonna be around, so if like you're going to dinner somewhere and you want to tell us, like we'll come. But if you're like sick of us for a while, you don't have to. But just so you know, we're kind of around. Tomorrow we're gonna start at 8 a.m. I'm gonna do another session in the morning.
9 a.m.
9 a.m.
9 a.m.
You see it?
Yeah. All right. I'll tell you what, I think we have a little margin in the morning. If I said 9:30, so you go get a coffee.
Oh.
There's no coffee tomorrow. No, it's Tuesday, Thursday, right?
She said Thursday first.
She said she prefers at different times.